Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. I've noticed a lot of people migrating from Cakewalk to Studio One at the moment, and whether that's a permanent move or whether you're just testing the water, I thought I'd make a guide just to ease the initial pain a little bit for you. Now there's a lot to get through, so this is going to be a pretty long video, so let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. Let's start off by starting Cakewalk. We get the splash screen, of course. Then as it opens up, you'll see notably in the bottom right hand corner, it does a scan of all your VST plugins down there. And then we have this start screen in the middle where you can either select a recent project or you can go to the new project tab and create a new project either from one of these templates or create a blank new project like so. If we start Studio One, of course, it's a little bit different. So when Studio One starts up, it does scan your VSTs just like Cakewalk does. So it whizzes through those, but it does a few other checks as well. Notably, it checks things like whether you've previously had hardware connected which is no longer connected, and it will ask you if you want to reconnect if it finds that, or if you've previously had a crash when using Studio One, it'll allow you the option of starting up in safe mode. Okay, so that's one of the things you can do with that. Now once you have started up, you do have the same options as Cakewalk here. You've got your recent files which are on the left hand side here. You just click on those and start using them right away, or you can create a new file. You do that by clicking on new up here, and we'll look at that later. But there's a few other things on this start screen which are not in Cakewalk. First of all, in the middle at the top, we've got the artist profile. Now from Studio One version 6 onward, we can switch artist profiles like so. So you can set up several different artists, and once you select that artist, any new projects you create at that time will have that artist profile applied. So the metadata of the projects will have that artist profile in there. That can be useful later on, especially with things like mastering and releasing. Also in the middle here, we have a SoundCloud connection here. So if you use SoundCloud, you can connect it up with your SoundCloud account. I don't use SoundCloud very much, but it's useful if you use it because you can actually publish directly to SoundCloud from Studio One. Then over on the right hand side, you've got this news feed. This is super useful. There's some great tutorials and things come up in here, as well as news about Studio One, and it's updated all the time. Okay, so there's always new things going on in there. Now significantly for me, in the middle at the bottom, we also have this setup area. This is something that Cakewalk doesn't have, and if you're using any DAW for the first time, it's really the first thing you need to do is set up your audio devices, and if you want to set up things like your Midi keyboards and things as well. So rather than dive into opening a new project and learning how to do various things within a project, let's actually start off by setting up our hardware. So if you want to configure your hardware in Cakewalk, you need to go to Preferences. I'll press P on my keyboard to get there, and then for the audio interface you're using, you need to go to Audio, Devices, click on there, and then you would select the inputs and the outputs for the particular audio interface that you want to use. Okay, now likewise with MIDI, you would go to MIDI and Devices, and it will show you a list of the MIDI devices on your system, and you'll select your MIDI inputs and your MIDI outputs that you want to use from there. Okay, that's in Cakewalk. In Studio One, as I say, right from the start page or the front page here, we've got the option to actually configure these things from that front page. Okay, but in actual fact, these are just shortcuts to something called options. Now options is the equivalent of preferences in Cakewalk. You can open options at any time from either the start page or within a project by clicking on Control comma on your keyboard, and that's the shortcut to open up options. These two selectable things on the front page here, configure audio devices, configure external devices, are shortcuts to specific sections of options, so they get you there quickly. So let's configure our audio device. I'll click on that, and here you simply select one of the audio interfaces on your system. As you can see, I've got many. You've probably only got one or two at the most, but you simply select that. You don't at this point select the inputs and outputs. I do believe, you correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, it does automatically select the first two inputs and the main outputs for you. I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure it does do that though. So you don't need to do that here. And if you want extra inputs, you can do that from within the song that you're working on. Now, once you've selected your audio interface, you'll see some information down here. I've got the block size, the sample rate, etc. shown here. Now, with some audio interfaces, you can actually change that directly from this screen, but with some you can't. Mine falls into the can't category. So what I need to do is click on Control Panel up here. When I click on Control Panel, it actually opens up the interface for the device driver for my particular audio interface. So yours is going to look different to this, okay? Unless you've got the same audio interface as me. So then I can make my selections for buffer size, etc. from there. Okay, so that is the audio interface set up. I'll click on OK and I can close the options there. And now I want to set up a MIDI keyboard. So I'm going to go to Configure External Devices. I'll click on that. Again, that opens up options, but directly opens up the External Devices tab. You can see I've got some already connected. I've got a couple of control surfaces and things already set, but I'm going to now add my keyboard. So I just go down to the bottom, click on Add. Now you'll see that there's a list of existing keyboards here, okay, by popular manufacturers and some popular keyboards. If yours is in that list, go for that, just select that. If not, go to the top and just click on New Keyboard. And then I like to do it properly. I fill this out. So I'll go to Manufacturer. This is an Arturia keyboard, and it's my, let's go, Keylab 88 Mark II, okay. And then once I've done that, I can go down. I can either use all of the MIDI channels or select specific ones. I'll just keep them all on. I'll go to Receive From. It shows me a list of MIDI keyboards or MIDI devices on my system. I find my Keylab Mark II. 88 there, select that. You can actually filter out things like aftertouch, program changes and things like that here. I'm not going to do that. The main thing I want to do is select my Send To, which is, so I'm doing inputs and outputs here. So I'll again select Keylab Mark II 88. And that's pretty much all, apart from a few other options you've got available, but that keyboard will now be available in all of my songs. So I'll click on OK and it appears there. You can see that there. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, if you start up Studio One and that is switched off, for example, and it can't detect it, it will now warn you in the future, hey, that keyboard is switched off. Do you want to reconnect it, kind of a thing? Okay. So that's the basic setups that most of us will need to do before we can realistically start to create projects. Now let's go ahead and create a project. So if you want to create a new project in Cakewalk, you will click on New Project on the left here, and then you can either select one of these templates or you can go ahead and click on Empty Project. Now, project in Studio One means something quite different. In Studio One, it relates to a mastering project. So a place where you're going to have perhaps many songs and it's got a dedicated interface for actual mastering. So rather than create projects when we want to record a new song in Studio One, we'll go over there, you actually create a new song. And to do that, you go up to New at the top left, click on that. And just like in Cakewalk, you can see there's a number of templates available here, or indeed you can create your own user templates. You can see those here. I've got a few there. But if you just want to create a blank song, then you just select this first one at the top, record and mix new Studio One song. And then over on the right hand side, you'll give it a name. So I'm going to call it A Song. Clever, huh? Now I want you to notice here also that I can select a path for this song. I'm not going to change it at the moment, but you can, I just want you to note that I'm saving mine in a folder called Studio One Files and then Songs. Yeah, and then it's going to create a new folder called A Song once I create this project. Now we're going to look at options for this a little bit later on in this video, but you should know that once it creates the folder for this particular song, it's going to create other folders eventually within that folder relating to different resources that it uses for the song. I know I've heard a number of people asked about this because it's a very similar situation in Cakewalk, and they wanted to make sure that that's the case. Now, I have seen some varying replies to those answers, so I should clarify. For me, with my setup, it is the case that it saves everything needed for that song in the folder. In this case, it will be called a song, of course. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, and of course it opens up this blank song. I just want to show you something really, really quickly here. If we go to the folder, which I talked about earlier, this is my songs folder in Studio One, and you can see that there's lots of folders within there relating to each song. Remember, mine was called a song. Well, if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see it has created that folder there. Okay, we can go inside, and it's got nothing inside it at the moment. Let's go back here, because I just want you to note that I haven't saved anything here. I haven't done anything in this new project. I'm going to go up to the top and close this new project without having made any changes, and then I'm going to show you that folder, and you'll notice if I scroll all the way down to the bottom where it was, that folder a song, even if I go to the top, a song has gone. So just take note, you're not going to end up with lots of sort of rubbish folders in there if you end up not doing anything. It doesn't really start populating it and keeping that folder alive until you make your first save. So let me quickly go ahead again, go to new, type in a song, click on OK, open my new project, and let's see what we're going to do in terms of recording some audio. There's a number of different ways to create an audio track in Cakewalk. I'll just use one of them now. I'm going to right click on this panel here and select Insert Audio Track. The next thing I might like to do is go up here, double click here, and give it a name. Let's call it guitar, for example. I'd also like to arm it for recording, so I'll click on this button here to arm it for recording. And if I wanted to listen to what I was recording, I would turn on input echo. That's if I want to listen to it through Cakewalk. Okay, so I'll switch that on. And the other thing that I would normally do at this point is select an input, and to do that I'll go to this input drop down here, and then I'll select from one of the existing inputs. I'll leave it on the one that's currently selected at the moment. Now, importantly, if I wanted to create some new inputs from my audio interface or make them available, I'd have to go to preferences as we did earlier. But that's the basic kind of setup of an audio track. Let's look at the same process in Studio One. I'll go over to Studio One. I'm going to right click on this panel over here, and I can either select add audio tracks mono or stereo. By the way, there's other ways of doing this, just like Cakewalk, but this is the most straightforward way. The next thing I'd do in the same fashion is rename it. So I'll go to its track name here, double click. I'm going to call it guitar, just like I did earlier. Renaming it is a little bit more significant in Studio One, as we'll see in a moment. We'll talk about that later. But first of all, I'm going to do as I did in Cakewalk. I'm going to arm it for recording by clicking on this button here. And I can also toggle the monitoring on and off. It was called input echo in Cakewalk. It's called monitor here. Okay. And now I want to select an input. Now, if I go to the drop down here, you can see I've already got some available. As I mentioned earlier, I think it does create some default ones when you set up your audio interface. Let me know if I'm wrong about that in the comments. Now, if your input that you want to use is not available here, you can actually go to audio input output setup here and click on that. It's going to open up the song setup directly with the correct tab that you need to use here. So we can see my existing inputs here that we saw in the drop down menu. To add a new stereo one, I'll just go down here to add stereo, click on that, and by default it selects the next two available inputs that have not already been used, but I can go ahead and select different ones or different pairs if I wish. So I'm actually going to go ahead and not only select these two, but also name the input. This is a really nice way of making the inputs user friendly. And if I was always going to use this for the guitar, then I'll name it guitar, like so. I'll go ahead and click on OK, and now that input is available from that drop down menu. It's called guitar, and I can select it. Now, before we go ahead and actually record something, one of the other things that we may want to do is set up a click or a metronome. Over in Cakewalk, you would do that up in this section here. You could toggle it on and off for recording or playback here. You can set a tempo here manually by typing in here, and you can also do tap tempo. I won't show you how to do that in Cakewalk, but I'll show you how to do it in Studio One. If we go over to Studio One, the metronome options are actually at the bottom of the screen. We can toggle our metronome off and on by clicking on this icon here, and it does that for recording and playback. Now, I'd recommend you use the keyboard shortcut, which is C for click, and you can easily just switch that off and on as you wish while you're doing your recording. You can also set the tempo over here in a similar way by clicking on the number here and typing in whatever number you want. And if you want to set a tempo by tapping, just hover over the word tempo here and then just click with your mouse. Do it for a while, like so, 2, 3, 4, and it will come up with an average value for whatever rate you're clicking for there. Okay, so set it to 104. I can reset it again to 120 by typing in there. So we've got our track set up and we've got our tempo set up. Now in Cakewalk, if you were going to use the record button, you could also long press on the record button here to get some recording options. Okay, and you'll notice that over in Studio One you don't have a similar thing that you can do. There's no long press on the record button. To get to the recording options, you need to go over to the right here and just click on this little cog here, and that shows you the various options for recording, different modes and things. Now the options are not exactly the same as Cakewalk, and we don't have enough time here to go through the various different options, but if you're looking for recording options, that's where you will find them. Now let's just go quickly back to Cakewalk and actually record some audio. Well, it's actually empty audio that we're recording with the click on here, because I don't have anything plugged into that input, but that's fine. That will serve as an example for us. Notice that it's simply called a default name. It's called Record 4 here. Okay, just note that for a moment. That becomes significant in Studio One. And the thing that we've got here that we can select and adjust is called a clip. Over in Studio One, if we do the same and we hit record, and we'll do that for a few seconds again with the metronome on, and I'll stop that there, you can see that something has been created here. It's no longer called a clip in Studio One, it's called an event, just a different terminology. But do notice that this event has been named according to what the name of our track is here. So I called it guitar, and the event is also called guitar. We can do that in Cakewalk, but we have to actually manually go in and rename it. So something just a little bit different there between the two doors. So that's the basics of recording audio. What about recording MIDI or virtual instruments? If I wanted to record some MIDI using a virtual instrument in Cakewalk, I'd go to my Browse panel on the right hand side. I'd select the Instrument tab. I'd go down to the folder of the maker of this virtual instrument. In this case, I'll go for Modder. I'll expand that folder. I'll select the plugin I want to use, and I'll drag it and drop it in the middle of my project here. Now in Cakewalk, it gives you a bunch of options before you add this instrument. Most of these things, I think all of these things, in fact, can be changed later, but it allows you to set them up on the way in, as it were. You can also switch this off so it doesn't do it every time, but as we'll see with Studio One, this is going to be a little bit different. So I'll click on OK. I'll accept the default options for a simple instrument track. That is MIDI and the actual virtual instrument combined onto one track, and I'll click on OK. It's going to go ahead and create that track with that virtual instrument, and once it's done that, we can see it there. The next thing I may want to do is actually select one of my devices for input. Now I could leave it on the default option here, which is Omni, so that's going to detect MIDI input from anything which is connected, or I could select something specific. Let's select something specific. We'll go for Mini Labs 3. I'll go for MIDI Omni, which means it's just going to record record on any MIDI channel there. Okay, so that's already set up. I can then go ahead and arm it for recording. Before I do anything, I'm just going to test, make sure it's working. That seems fine. I'll go ahead and hit record and record some notes. Excuse my rudimentary playing. I'll stop there. Let's close the instrument, and we can see the clip has been created here, and you can see the MIDI notes in there as well. Let's look at the same process in Studio One. So I'll go to Studio One. There's also a browse panel which is open already on the right hand side. You can toggle that with the button at the bottom right there, to switch it off and on. And there's a bunch of tabs for different things you can add at the top here, and they've got shortcuts on this sort of home page here as well. I'll click on Instruments. I'll go down to the Mod Art folder again. In this case, I'll expand it. I can see my two Pianotech plugins there. I'll select Pianotech 8, take it, drag it across and drop it in the middle. And there's no dialog box this time. It just simply inserts it. You do have a number of the options available that were available in Cakewalk as well. But you don't have to set them all up front, as it were, with the options panel. So I've got that in there, and again I'd want to select a MIDI input. Now you can see on my particular setup at the moment that I have the inspector panel open on the left hand side. That's this panel all the way over on the left. You can toggle that with the I button at the top or by pressing F4 on your keyboard, and you'll need that open in order to select your MIDI input device. You can see right down here it's set to all inputs at the moment. That's just like Omni in Cakewalk, and I can select a specific device here. I'll go for the Keylab 88, which I set up earlier. It's armed for recording already, and then I just have to hit the record button and play a few notes. Again, wonderful playing, as you can hear there. I'll click on stop and I'll close this. And again, you can see the event has been created here, and you can see the MIDI notes there. Now, it was rather rudimentary playing, so I probably want to go in there and edit my MIDI. So let's talk about editing next. If I wanted to edit my MIDI in Cakewalk, I'd probably just double click on the clip that has the MIDI in it, and it'll automatically open up the piano roll view. And for me, that's the most common way of editing MIDI, but it's not the only way. Some people like to use a score or a staff view. You can do that at the top by going up to views and then going down to where it says staff view, or you could click on Alt-6 and open up the staff view like that, and you can see that there. Another way that we may want to edit MIDI if this was a drum part is to use something called a drum map. Now, that's not as easy as just opening a view in Cakewalk. There's a little bit of a process with it, but it is possible. Now, for audio, it's not quite the same thing. If we click on this audio track up here or double click on it, nothing happens. And that's because there's no sort of audio editor as such in Cakewalk. You can set it up with external editors. There's a little bit of a setup process involved with that. It's a tiny bit geeky. I'm not going to cover that here, but it's worth noting that. Apart from that, the main way that you would probably edit audio in Cakewalk is just in the tracks view, and you could expand that and do basic edits in there. Okay. Now in Studio One, it's all a little bit different. Rather than having lots and lots of views, I would say it's more context driven. So I'll go over there and show you what I mean. So if, for example, I want to edit that MIDI, just like in Cakewalk, I could double click on the event here and it'll open up the piano roll view by default for that MIDI. But I can easily switch over to the score view by clicking on this little icon here. That brings that up. Or I can go to the drum map view. This would make more sense if it was actually some drums, but you can see it just switches to that view using these toggle switches here. Now, if I leave this open and then select an audio clip at the top, it's going to immediately just go over to the audio editing view here. We don't need an external editor, although I would say that this is still rather rudimentary. There's nothing particularly fancy about this, but it does at least open up in a separate view like so. And by the way, of course, you can expand this view in the same way you can with Cakewalk, of course. Okay, so that's the basics of how you get to the editing. I will say you will have to go in and experiment. There's different possibilities with different doors. I actually find the MIDI editing in Studio One pretty good. But if you're used to the Cakewalk one, it may take a little bit of learning, but that's how you actually get to the editors. Now, of course, in Cakewalk, we have something called the console view. That's the mixer, if you like. We can get to it by going to views at the top and clicking on console view, or you could press Alt 2 as well to bring it up. So we can see at the bottom of the screen here, and it sort of mimics a mixer on a recording console in a studio, and we can expand it, make it bigger like so, just by dragging up like this. Okay, and that's going to be helpful to us so that we can see all of the controls. Now you can see the basic layout of each channel is that you've got a gain knob at the top there, then you've got your pro channel stuff, then you've got effects, then you've got sends, and then you've got a few basic controls for automation, stereo, mono, muting, solo, all that good stuff there. A pan control, a fader here, and some options for setting outputs and routing. Okay, that's the very basics of what you do with the console there. And it's not so different in Studio One. Let's go over there. We open it up by clicking on the mix button over here on the bottom right, or you can press F3 on the keyboard to toggle it on and off. Just like in Cakewalk, you can expand it like so and drag it up. Now it's got a lot of the same things, although not all of them. So we don't see an actual gain control at the top. It's not switched on by default. You can switch it on though. Go over to the little cog on the left hand side here, click on that, then go down to input controls and just turn that on. Okay, and that makes sure that you can see your gain control at the top there, just like you can in Cakewalk. Got some controls for polarity and things there as well. Going down, of course, we don't have the pro channel. There is the fat channel, which is a different thing in Studio One. I won't go into that now, but just like in Cakewalk, we have an insert section that's called effects in Cakewalk. Then we have sends. Then we have some routing options above the fader, etc. And then we have usual stuff for panning, for example. We've got that there, muting, soloing, all of that good stuff. One big difference that you have in Studio One, apart from being able to expand the mixer just like you do in Cakewalk, is you can resize different parts of the tracks here. So you can resize the divider between inserts and sends. You can actually drag that whole area that controls the fader, etc., up and down as well. So I must admit I much prefer being able to do that. So beyond that, it's essentially the same with a slightly different arrangement of things. So you should be able to get up to speed pretty quick with the different tracks. Let's look at the different types of tracks which are available quickly. In Cakewalk, we've got the tracks which are created as audio channels for the various virtual instruments and audio tracks we've recorded. We can also create new tracks of different kinds. So we could just create a new audio track or a MIDI track in here. By the way, MIDI tracks aren't shown in the mixer in Studio One. And over on the right hand side, we can create buses. So we could insert a stereo bus over there like so, and we can route things to buses. Okay, so we've created that stereo bus there, and I could do a send from one of these tracks over here, select that, and then send it to bus D as I've created there. We've got a level here, and if we wanted to add some effects, we could do that over here in bus D. Click on the effects there, insert an audio effect. I'll just add anything, it doesn't really matter at the moment. Okay, and that's how you would do a send to a bus which has an effect in it in Cakewalk. Now in Studio One, it's a little bit different. In Studio One, well, let's look at how it's the same to begin with. I'll just right click here, add a bus. yeah, and it creates that bus, but it's not over on the right hand side with the master bus. It keeps outputs and other tracks separate in Studio One, although buses can be set up to remain on the right hand side within this area if you like. That's over in the options over here. Okay, so for example, you can go keep bus channels to the right, etc. Yeah, so that's how you create a bus. And again, you could add an effect in there. I'll just add again anything that I can find there. So I've added my effect in there. I could do a send, yeah, like so, to that bus. All the same, except in Studio One it can be done much more simply. I'm just going to remove that bus completely. I'm going to remove that send. What I could do is open up the browser, yeah, like so, go to my effects again. I'll just grab one of these effects. I'm just going to drag it over to the send section of my track in Studio One, drop it there, and it automatically creates the bus, it creates the send, it does everything for you. So that little thing is a bit easier in Studio One. Now, as well as buses, you can also create different things in here. You've also got an effects channel here, yeah, so like so. You've also got some auxiliary channels. Now, I've made some videos about routing in Studio One, and I've explained the differences between all of these different types of channels, so I'm just going to make you aware at the moment that they exist. One I will mention though, which is quite different, is the fact that we can create VCA channels in Studio One. I'll add a VCA channel. They have red knobs on the faders, if you like, and what they do is they enable you to control several things. These are not audio tracks, but they enable you to control several other tracks at the same time. So if I assign this one to that VCA and this one to that VCA, for example, I'll just give them a difference in their mix, then I can use the VCA to control both of them at the same time. A little bit like using groups, which exist in Cakewalk, and indeed groups do exist in Studio One as well, but just a different way of doing things there. So that's the other type of track, if you like, that you can add to the console in Studio One. I know that many of you, like me, like to detach some of your panels so that you can drag them off onto a second monitor or something like that. Gives you a bit more flexibility in your workflow. In Cakewalk, you could grab the console like so, grab the tab at the bottom and then just drag it like so, take that off to another screen, resize it, etc. And then you can redock it if you want like so, okay? Another thing you could do in Cakewalk is with the piano roll view or whatever editor you're using is do the same. You can just grab its tab, drag it off like so. You could take it off to another monitor, whatever you want to do with it in that way. It's very, very similar in Studio One. If we go over there, I'll open up my mix view here. You can see on the left hand side there's this little icon for detaching, so I'll detach that. It goes off into its own separate window which you can drag around. You can take that off to another monitor if you like, resize it to full screen, whatever you want to do there. If you want to attach it again, just go to the right hand side this time and click on the attach button, yeah, and it attaches back to the bottom of the screen. The same for the piano roll. I'll just open that up. You can see that this time the detach button's on the right hand side over here. I'll click on that. Again, I can resize that, drag it around, take it off to another screen, all that good stuff, and then I can just click on the attach button to pop it back where it was. So pretty similar to Cakewalk, definitely the same capabilities and very useful in my opinion. Before we finish off, I'd like to help you out with some useful settings in terms of paths. Now, whether you're on the start page here or in a project, you can hit Control, as we discussed earlier, to open up options. Then I want you to go to the Locations tab at the top here, click on that, and then make sure you're on the User Data tab just down here. And that's where you would set up the main folder where your Studio One files are going to be saved. Now, I've got this set, as we saw earlier, to my F drive, and I created a folder called Studio One Files. Later on, when you create a new song, as we did earlier, it's then going to create a subfolder for songs, projects, shows, presets, etc. And then within that, you create the folder or the name of your project. It will create a folder as per the name of your project in those subfolders, if that makes sense. Then everything you need for a song will be in that one folder. So it's pretty useful to set that up. It may be initially in like My Documents or something like that by default. I would suggest that you're better off to have it on a separate drive than your system drive, but it doesn't matter too much if you've got it on your system drive these days, but it's preferable to have it on a separate drive, okay? Now, the other thing that I would like to point you in the direction of is this tab here. If you go to the VST plugins tab here, this is where you set up all the various different locations where a Studio One should search for VST plugins. Okay, so you can see mine there. Yours will be different, some of them will be the same. I've got some specific ones there, but you would have had to have set this up in Cakewalk at some stage in order to capture all the VSTs on your system. So one of the things you could do is just sort of take a note or a screenshot of the locations that you've got it set up in Cakewalk and then duplicate that here. Okay, I think it's pretty self-explanatory how you do it. You just click on add down here and you set up the path. Now I want to note as well that when we first started up Studio One today, it did a scan of the VST plugins. I like it to do it every time because I'm always adding new plugins and removing plugins. But if that's not the case for you, if you only add new plugins once in a while, then I would suggest you just click on this or uncheck this option here, which is scan at startup. It's just going to make Studio One just start up a little bit quicker for you, so that might be a good idea. Now, of course, Studio One comes with a whole bunch of stock plugins which are quite different to the Cakewalk ones. So if you want to learn about those, I've got a playlist right here. I've covered a few of the major ones. I recommend you watch that right now.